2013, the world watched and waited. The Assad regime had crossed a line drawn by the President of the United States. Use chemical weapons, and there will be consequences. The sarin gas attack came, but the consequences never did. What followed was not peace, but a precedent, a signal to allies, adversaries, and institutions about how the world's most powerful nation draws lines and what it does when those lines are crossed. This is the story of the strike that never happened and the damage it still causes.
What happens when a superpower draws a line in the sand and then, well, steps back?
It's a huge question.
Yeah, imagine the tension back in August 2013. The whole world is watching Syria just holding its breath after these reports of a horrific chemical attack in Ghouta.
And the U.S. president had been very public about this red line concerning chemical weapons use.
So everyone, really everyone, expected some kind of military response. And then almost overnight, the plan just evaporates.
It changed completely.
We're the place you come to get past the noise and really understand the details behind complex global topics.
And analysts have been debating for years. The perceived challenge, maybe even erosion, of U.S. strategic credibility over the last couple of decades. We've got a whole stack of sources here, research papers, articles, intelligence reports.
Right, spanning roughly from, say, 2005 up to potentially 2025. And our goal here, for you listening, is to pull out the absolute key insights. How did specific international incidents shape the way America's allies, and just as importantly, its adversaries, started viewing its reliability, its strength?
And this isn't just dusty history. The analysts we're drawing on argue these moments weren't just, footnotes. They were seen as real turning points.
Turning points where allies maybe started quietly thinking, maybe we need a plan B. Can we totally rely on Washington?
Hedging their bets. And moments where adversaries might have looked at the situation and thought, okay, maybe there's an opening here. Maybe we can push the boundaries a bit.
It really gets to the heart of deterrence, doesn't it?
Right.
Why that perceived gap between what a power says and what it actually does, or sometimes what it doesn't do. The silence, why that can just shatter the perception of strength.
It absolutely can. So let's dive right in with that moment many point to as pivotal. The Syria Red Line crisis back in 2013.
Okay, let's set the scene properly. Go back a year, August 2012. President Obama explicitly states that the Assad regime using chemical weapons would be a red line.
And the implication was clear. Crossing that line would fundamentally change the U.S. calculus,
Right.
likely meaning military intervention.
Then, August 2013, boom, the Ghouta sarin attack happens. Hundreds of civilians dead, horrific images. It seemed undeniable that Assad's regime had crossed that very public red line.
International condemnation was swift and fierce.
And the sources are pretty clear on this. The U.S. administration was gearing up for military action. Missile strikes against Syrian regime targets were being planned.
And key allies were ready to join. France, under President Hollande at the time, was poised. Their warplanes were reportedly just hours from launch. They were committed.
But then the reversal. It was abrupt. President Obama sticks back from immediate strikes.
Right, first he pivots to seeking congressional approval, which, let's be honest, looked like it would be very difficult to get at that moment.
And then, even more significantly, the administration embraces this deal brokered by Russia. The deal involved Syria agreeing to declare and eliminate its declared chemical weapons arsenal under international supervision. Military strikes were off the table.
So, a massive shift in direction. How did the world react? The responses were, well, immediate and pretty dramatic, especially among U.S. allies.
Yeah, you really see that in the Middle East. Partners like Israel, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, others the sources describe real shock, dismay even.
They've been actively lobbying Washington, urging the U.S. to hit Assad and hit him hard. For them, Syria was a key battleground in the larger regional struggle against Iran.
It's fascinating, isn't it? You had traditional rivals like Israel and Saudi Arabia actually finding common ground, pushing the U.S. for a tough military response against Assad.
The analysis highlights Israeli officials being openly dismayed. Their big worry that looking soft on Assad, especially after he used chemical weapons, would send a dangerous signal to Tehran.
A signal that might embolden Iran regarding its nuclear ambitions?
Some Israeli voices put it very bluntly, basically saying, look, if you draw a red line, if you say you're going to strike, you have to strike. Otherwise, what do U.S. warnings even mean?
There's that quote from an Israeli deputy minister, Avi Wartzman, saying the American hesitance confirms that Israel should not trust others and their promises, but must be prepared to protect its own. That really cuts to the core of it, linking Syria directly to their concerns about Iran.
And Israeli media reflected this deep anxiety. Some commentators drew these stark historical parallels, one even saying, from Munich 1938 to Damascus 2013, nothing has changed.
Wow, that's incredibly strong language. It shows the depth of feeling, the sense that this was a moment of profound American irresolution and the Gulf states.
Similar feelings. Saudi Arabia had been a strong backer of military action. While they avoided public criticism of Obama directly, their disappointment was described as palpable. Their foreign minister, Prince Saud al-Faisal, was quoted lamenting that words were no longer enough.
And didn't the Saudis do something quite unusual at the UN?
They did, in what sources call an unprecedented protest. Saudi Arabia refused to take up a rotating seat on the UN Security Council that they'd just won.
Why? What reason did they give?
They cited international double standards and the failure of the international community, particularly regarding Syria. It was widely seen as a rare public rebuke, aimed, at least in part, at Washington's perceived indecisiveness and the failure to enforce the red line.
That kind of diplomatic move really signals just how frustrated some key U.S. partners were. Okay, what about in Europe? Were they all on the same page?
Not really. Reactions were much more mixed. It reflected different national viewpoints, public opinion. France, as we said, was ready to go. They were left in a really awkward spot when Obama hit pause.
High and dry, essentially.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Sources quote French diplomats calling the U.S. reversal stunning, especially after the UK Parliament had already voted against joining any strikes, which had put Paris out front as the main European military partner.
So the French still wanted action.
Well, President Holland still insisted Assad must be sanctioned, but the U.S. shift definitely forced a rethink. They eventually welcomed the disarmament deal, but called for it to be backed by a UN resolution with the threat of punitive action if Syria didn't comply.
And other European powers, like Germany?
Germany and others had been more hesitant about military action from the beginning, generally pushing for a political solution. The German press was quite divided on Obama's decision.
How so?
Some outlets praised the caution, seeing it as prudent, maybe even showing a little humility after the Iraq experience.
Sure.
Others were fiercely critical.
What were the criticisms?
Conservative papers slammed what they saw as a lack of resolve. One famously wished Obama were a bit more like George W. Bush, accusing him of dithering. Der Spiegel, a major news magazine, called the whole maneuver Obama's most risky and cynical chess move.
So quite a split. It sounds like the takeaway from Europe is complex. Some relief that war was avoided, definitely, but also significant concern, particularly among close allies, about what this meant for U.S. leadership, for predictability, for credibility.
And you have to remember the context in Europe still very war-weary after Iraq and Afghanistan. Public opinion in many countries leaned heavily towards diplomatic solutions over military ones. There were protests against intervention.
Okay, let's do a quick micro recap here. The U.S. stepping back from the Syria Red Line strikes. It caused real turbulence among allies, or Middle Eastern partners, particularly Israel and Saudi Arabia, felt dismayed, questioning U.S. reliability, especially vis-a-vis Iran. In Europe, reactions were divided relief in some quarters, but real anxiety in others about American leadership and resolve.
Right. While allies were largely dismayed or confused, U.S. adversaries saw the situation very differently. They generally welcomed the U.S. decision to pull back from military strikes.
Russia, most obviously. They were staunchly opposed to Western intervention in Syria, seeing Assad as an ally. They immediately jumped in to frame themselves as the ones finding a diplomatic solution.
Moscow flatly denied the Assad regime was responsible for the Gudo attack, Putin calling the idea absolute nonsense. And when Washington accepted the Russian brokered disarmament deal, the Kremlin portrayed it as this huge diplomatic win.
Saved Syria from aggression, basically.
That was the narrative, and Syrian state media ran with it, calling the deal a victory for Syria achieved thanks to our Russian friends. They were essentially bragging about having stared down the U.S.
Russian state media piled on too, right?
What? They openly mocked Obama's hesitation. You had outlets saying he was delaying his own demise, pundits on TV declaring Washington blinked. It was quite triumphalist.
And Putin himself got involved directly in the messaging.
He did. He published that very high-profile opinion piece in the New York Times in September 2013. In it, he praised the disarmament deal, warned against U.S. airstrikes, pointing to the chaos after Iraq and Libya, argued for sticking to the UN process, and even took a shot at the idea of American exceptionalism.
That was a pretty bold move, publishing that in the NYT.
It really was. It underscored Moscow's feeling that they'd really gained the upper hand diplomatically in this crisis.
What about Iran, Assad's other major backer?
For Tehran, the outcome was also seen as a major positive. They had warned loudly against any U.S. attack on Syria. When the strikes didn't happen, Iranian officials hailed the U.S. retreat, praising American rationality.
Even the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, commented through state media proxies that the Americans, including Congress, had acted rationally.
Their relief was clear. First, their key regional ally, Assad, was more secure. Second, and maybe just as important, a precedent of U.S. military action against a state possessing WMD's chemical weapons in this case was avoided. That had obvious implications for Iran's own nuclear standoff with the West.
So less risk for Assad, less risk of a precedent being set.
Media outlets close to the Revolutionary Guards were quoted crowing that the U.S. won't risk another war.
Although the sources do mention an interesting counter-narrative within Iran, right? Some saw Obama's willingness to compromise, to choose diplomacy over force, as maybe a good sign for potential nuclear talks with Iran itself.
Yes, that view existed, particularly as high-level nuclear talks did pick up later. Obama himself argued Iran should see this as proof diplomacy could work. But the dominant perception, especially among hardliners in Tehran, seems to have been that America had simply lost its nerve for a fight.
And China. How did Beijing view this?
Favorably. China consistently opposes unilateral military action and prefers multilateral solutions through the UN. They had joined Russia in vetoing stronger anti-Assad resolutions earlier, so when the U.S. shifted toward the UN-backed disarmament deal, China welcomed it.
They emphasized things like UN consensus and Syrian sovereignty.
Precise. Chinese state media had this sort of told-you-so tone, arguing that American hegemonism had been effectively checked. The deal was framed as a win for multilateralism, proving the wisdom of seeking a political solution.
And finally, the Assad regime itself.
Pure exultation, according to the sources. Officials called it a victory. Assad adopted this triumphant tone, denying he'd used chemical weapons, but taking credit for agreeing to join the Chemical Weapons Convention as an act of statesmanship.
While his state media pushed narratives that Obama backed down because he knew attacking would be futile.
Right, alongside conspiracy theories about rebels staging the attack, reports from Damascus described a celebratory mood, people rallying with Assad's portrait and Russian flags, thanking Putin for shielding the regime.
So summing up the view from adversaries, it was largely relief mixed with a sense of triumph. Russia claimed a diplomatic victory and challenged U.S. power. Iran felt vindicated and perhaps emboldened. China saw its preference for multilateralism validated. And the Syrian regime itself felt it had won, securing a degree of immunity.
Okay, let's do a quick micro recap on adversary reactions. Unlike allies who were dismayed, adversaries generally welcomed the U.S. pullback from the red line. Russia saw it as a diplomatic coup. Iran felt its support for Assad was validated. China was pleased diplomacy trumped force, and the Syrian regime claimed outright victory.
All right, let's lock in this whole Red Line episode mega recap. The Red Line aftermath. That moment, the U.S. visibly chose diplomacy over military force. After drawing such a clear red line, it sent shockwaves. Allies started questioning U.S. reliability, while adversaries saw openings.
Here are those key takeaways, the flashcard facts, if you will.
First, August 2013, Assad crosses Obama's chemical weapons red line in Ghouta.
Second, the U.S. cancels planned strikes, opting instead for that Russian-brokered disarmament deal.
Third, key Middle East allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia were dismayed. They felt the U.S. looked soft and had urged a hard strike.
So fourth, European allies were split. France was ready to strike and felt stunned by the U.S. pause. Others were more cautious.
A fifth, Russia claimed a major diplomatic victory, portraying itself as saving Syria from aggression. Putin openly mocked U.S. hesitation.
Sixth, Iran hailed the U.S. decision as rationality, seeing the retreat as validating its backing of Assad.
Seventh, China was pleased that the UN and multilateral diplomacy were prioritized over unilateral force.
And eighth, the Syrian regime itself claimed victory and clearly felt emboldened.
Now, this crisis wasn't just about the U.S. and its relations. It put international institutions and norms under immense pressure.
Especially the UN Security Council and that fundamental norm against the use of chemical weapons.
Initially, the Security Council was stuck, wasn't it? Paralyzed by Russian and Chinese vetoes on any strong action against Assad.
Right, but the dynamic shifted after the U.S.-Russia deal for disarmament. Suddenly you saw this unusual unity. They unanimously adopted Resolution 2118 in late September 2013.
What did Resolution 2118 actually do?
It formally endorsed the plan to destroy Syria's declared chemical weapons stockpile. And, importantly, it included language warning of potential Chapter 7 measures if Syria failed to comply.
Chapter 7, that's the part of the UN Charter allowing for enforcement actions, potentially including military force, right?
Correct. Although it wasn't an automatic trigger. But the unanimous vote was seen as significant. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon hailed it as a breakthrough, proof the Council could act when the US and Russia found common ground.
And the actual disarmament mission that followed, led by the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in the UN,
That was widely seen as a remarkable success, at least logistically. They managed to remove and destroy hundreds of tons of declared chemical agents from Syria, even amidst the ongoing civil war. It was a huge operational feat.
and that work contributed directly to the OPCW winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 2013.
Yes, the OPCW Director General specifically praised the US-Russia deal for making that rapid elimination possible. Initially, it was presented as a major win for arms control, enforcing a vital norm without resorting to war.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
There is. While the declared weapons were removed, many analysts argue that justice and, importantly, future deterrence were left wanting.
How so?
Well, Resolution 2118 deliberately avoided assigning blame for the Ghouta attack. And as we mentioned, there was no automatic penalty if Syria cheated or didn't fully comply.
And the evidence suggests Syria did cheat. Reports kept emerging of continued chemical weapons used by the regime, particularly chlorine attacks, suggesting they hadn't declared everything or had retained production capabilities.
And when these reports surfaced, the UN Security Council fell back into its old pattern of deadlock. Russia consistently used its veto power to block any attempts at Chapter 7 enforcement or referring the situation to the International Criminal Court for prosecution.
So accountability was effectively blocked at the UN level.
Completely. The UN Secretary General himself expressed deep frustration, noting that chemical attacks were continuing with impunity. He called it the most serious test of the international chemical weapons ban since its inception.
What about the OPCW itself? How did it handle this?
Its role had to evolve. Initially focused on overseeing the destruction of the declared stockpile, it then had to pivot towards investigating these new allegations of ongoing use.
They set up fact-finding missions.
Yes, and later a joint UN OPCW investigative body, the JIM, specifically tasked with attributing responsibility for chemical attacks.
And what did they find?
Their reports confirmed chemical weapons used by both the Syrian government and ISIS. But again, this attribution work became highly politicized. Russia disputed the findings, targeting the Assad regime, and eventually used its veto power at the UN to disband the JIM in 2017.
So another mechanism blocked, but the OPCW member states pushed back.
They did. In 2018, in a move outside the Security Council, the OPCW Conference of States Parties took the unprecedented step of giving the organization itself the power to attribute responsibility for chemical attacks.
And they used that power.
Yes. Following investigations that attributed further attacks to the Syrian regime, the OPCW took another major step in April 2021. They suspended Syria's voting rights and privileges within the organization due to its repeated violations and non-compliance.
So norm enforcement started happening, but it had to shift venue away from the gridlocked Security Council.
Precisely. It showed the system trying to adapt, but also highlighted the deep challenges when a major power, like Russia, actively shields a state violating core international norms.
What role did NATO play in all this back in 2013?
NATO as an alliance wasn't directly involved in any military planning against Syria, but individual allies were, obviously. NATO provided some support, like deploying Patriot air defense missiles to Turkey, which borders Syria, and the alliance collectively expressed outrage over the chemical attacks.
Secretary General Rasmussen called them appalling and inexcusable.
Right. But NATO operates by consensus, with no UN mandate for force and key allies divided or constrained by domestic politics like the UK Parliament's no vote, or Obama seeking congressional approval. The alliance itself didn't take collective military action.
Rasmussen framed those democratic processes as a strength, actually.
He did. But sources suggest that behind closed doors, NATO military planners and strategists were concerned. The perceived U.S. hesitation, the public divisions, the ultimate pullback from the red line. It all raised questions about Western resolve and the credibility of deterrence.
Especially looking ahead to other potential challenges.
This experience likely fed into NATO's later renewed focus on strengthening deterrence, particularly on its eastern flank after Russia's actions in Ukraine began shortly after. The implicit lesson seemed to be that ambiguity or perceived irresolution could be dangerously provocative.
Okay, another quick micro recap, this time on institutions and norms. The Syria crisis really put the international system to the test. The UN Security Council managed a success with the disarmament deal, leading to the OPCW's Nobel Prize. but failed on accountability for the use of those weapons due to vetoes. The OPCW itself had to adapt, eventually gaining powers to attribute blame outside the UN. And NATO, while not acting directly, worried internally about the implications for Western deterrence credibility.
All right, let's pull that section together. End of chapter mega recap. Institutions and norms tested. While the diplomatic process successfully removed Syria's declared chemical arsenal, the failure to hold anyone accountable for using those weapons significantly eroded the norm against chemical warfare. It exposed the limits of international institutions when major powers disagree on enforcement.
Key flashcard facts on this.
The UN Security Council, initially paralyzed, then united for disarmament under Resolution 2118, but ultimately failed on accountability and enforcement because of Russian vetoes.
The OPCW oversaw the weapon destruction, winning the Nobel Peace Prize, but then had to pivot to investigate ongoing use, attribute blame, and eventually suspend Syria's rights.
See, first, his continued use of chemical weapons after 2013 fundamentally challenged the success of the initial disarmament deal.
Forcia consistently used its veto power to shield the Assad regime and block accountability mechanisms at the UN.
And behind the scenes, NATO strategists worried about the signal being sent to adversaries regarding Western resolve and the credibility of its red lines.
Now let's make that connection. We're moving from the Syria crisis in 2013, just months later, to early 2014. The focus shifts dramatically from the Middle East to Eastern Europe, and specifically to Russia's annexation of Crimea.
This link is vital for understanding the trajectory towards the full-scale war in Ukraine in 2022.
So describe the Crimea shock of 2014. What happened?
Following Ukraine's pro-Western revolution of dignity, which ousted the pro-Russian President Yanukovych, things moved incredibly fast. Russian special forces, initially without insignia, the so-called Little Green Men, seized key government buildings and military bases across Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula.
This happened very quickly, almost bloodlessly in the initial phase.
Yes, and it was followed almost immediately by a hastily organized referendum on joining Russia, which was condemned internationally as illegitimate, but used by Moscow as justification for formally annexing Crimea in March 2014.
A major violation of international law and Ukrainian sovereignty. What was the immediate Western response?
Condemnation was swift and universal. But the actions taken were, according to most sources, notably cautious. The U.S. and its European allies imposed economic sanctions.
Targeting specific Russian officials, some banks, certain industries.
Right. And they kicked Russia out of the G8 group of industrialized nations, sending a strong diplomatic signal. But, and this is the point analysts emphasize, there was a clear lack of direct military intervention.
No Western boots on the ground, no direct confrontation with Russian forces.
Absolutely not. In fact, Washington and European capitals actively urged the new government in Kyiv to avoid any actions that could escalate the situation militarily.
President Obama made it quite clear, didn't he? He stated publicly that the U.S. would not go to war with Russia over a local conflict like Ukraine.
He did. And sources suggest that phrases like that, or the constant references to being deeply concerned, started to sound like code for Western inaction, even toothlessness, in some Ukrainian and Eastern European circles.
What about the European Union's response? Also measured.
Very much so. Sanctions were implemented, yes, but carefully calibrated. Most major business ties, especially in the energy sector, Europe's dependence on Russian gas and oil remained largely intact. One analysis described it starkly as restraint, no harsh sanctions. Business and diplomatic ties remained.
So a signal of displeasure, but not crippling economic warfare.
Not at that stage, no.
And NATO's response.
NATO reacted by reinforcing its own members. They significantly increased troop rotations and exercises in the Baltic states and Poland, the eastern flank, bordering Russia. This was a clear signal of commitment to defend NATO territory under Article 5.
But for Ukraine, which isn't a NATO member.
For Ukraine, NATO offered political support, condemnation of Russia's actions, and some non-lethal military aid and training. But it explicitly stopped far short of any security guarantee. No path to membership was offered, no promise of collective defense.
And what about providing Ukraine with weapons to defend itself?
That was highly restricted initially. Despite calls from some in the U.S. Congress, the Obama administration specifically refused to provide Ukraine with lethal weaponry, fearing it would provoke further Russian escalation.
So they sent things like blankets, medical supplies, maybe night vision goggles.
Non-lethal aid. More advanced defensive systems, like the Javelin anti-tank missiles Ukraine desperately wanted, weren't approved until several years later under the Trump administration. The dominant fear in 2014 was provoking Putin.
Instead of arming Ukraine, the focus was on diplomacy.
Yes, particularly through the so-called Minsk agreements, brokered primarily by Germany and France. Minsk First in 2014 and Minsk II in 2015 aimed to establish a ceasefire and a political settlement for the conflict that had erupted in eastern Ukraine after Crimea's annexation.
But these Minsk agreements are now widely seen as flawed, aren't they?
Deeply flawed, according to many analysts. They essentially froze the conflict lines, but imposed political conditions on Ukraine that were seen as heavily favoring Moscow's interests. Critics call Minsk a weak deal that basically demanded nothing of the invader and gave the Kremlin time and leverage.
There was even a former Putin aide, Vladislav Surkov, who later openly admitted that the Minsk process served to legitimize the first partition of Ukraine.
That's a stunning admission. So this overall response pattern in 2014, sanctions, yes, but cautious ones. Condemnation, yes, but no military pushback. Limited aid to Ukraine, weak diplomatic deals. It's widely interpreted now as a strategy that prioritized avoiding immediate confrontation over establishing long-term credible deterrence.
Kind of kick the can down the road approach.
You could see it that way.
Yeah.
The Wilson Center analysis summed it up. The restrained response saved security in the European theater in the short term, but severely damaged it in the long term. Russia faced limited consequences, consolidated its hold on Crimea, which became a launching pad in 2022, and Europe largely continued its energy reliance on Moscow, a decision later called a terrible mistake.
Okay, quick micro recap on the 2014 Crimea response. Western actions were defined by cautious restraint. Sanctions and condemnation, yes, but no military intervention, no immediate lethal aid for Ukraine, and diplomatic agreements, Minsk, seen as weak. The prevailing view now is that this prioritized short-term stability but failed to deter future Russian aggression.
Now, the question is, how did Russia's leadership, particularly Vladimir Putin, read this Western response? What lessons did they draw from 2014?
The sources seem unanimous on this. Putin interpreted the lack of a forceful, decisive Western reaction to the annexation of Crimea as a sign of weakness, a sign the West lacked the resolve to confront him.
The relatively limited consequences he faced for seizing territory from a sovereign neighbor were seen, in Moscow, as something like tacit permission, maybe even a tacit green light to go further.
The fact that the West didn't militarily push back, didn't immediately flood Ukraine with defensive weapons, that was taken as evidence they weren't willing to pay a significant price to defend a non-NATO partner like Ukraine.
And Putin seems to have acted on this perception almost immediately. Remember, just weeks after annexing Crimea, Russia began fomenting and supporting the armed separatist conflict in Ukraine's eastern Donbass region.
He calculated, correctly it turned out, that the Western response would again be limited primarily to more sanctions and strong words, not direct intervention.
And that simmering conflict in the Donbass over the next 8 years, directly fueled by Russia, is what analysts mean when they say Crimea set the stage for the full-scale invasion of 2022. It kept Ukraine destabilized and provided a pretext.
So this gets right back to the core issue of deterrence. Western deterrence, specifically regarding protecting Ukraine from further Russian aggression, clearly failed to stop Putin's escalation between 2014 and 2022.
As multiple analyses state, Western powers failed to deter Moscow's escalation to war in 2022, just as they failed to deter Moscow from annexing Crimea in 2014. That initial annexation really exposed gaps in the West's deterrence strategy concerning Russia.
And Putin likely didn't see 2014 in isolation, right? Sources suggest this perception of Western weakness was reinforced by other events, too.
Yes, things like the relatively muted Western response to Russia's war against Georgia in 2008, the perceived inaction after the Syria Red Line we just discussed, even observing the growing political polarization and perceived instability within the U.S. By the time 2021 rolled around, Putin likely believed this pattern of Western hesitation would hold.
Former U.S. Ambassador Ivo Dulder argues this point strongly. He says Putin's long observation of Western reactions, especially the weak international response to Crimea, convinced him the West would ultimately abandon Ukraine if Russia launched a bigger attack.
The calculation seems to have been Washington and Brussels would protest loudly, impose more sanctions, but they wouldn't actually fight to save Ukraine.
Putin also seems to have calculated that Russia could handle any new economic punishment.
Right. The sources suggest a key lesson Russia took from the 2014 sanctions was that they were survivable. The Russian economy adapted. And in the years following, Moscow took active steps to sanction-proof its economy, building up foreign currency reserves, developing alternative payment systems.
Plus, they saw Europe's continued heavy reliance on Russian energy which probably fed the calculation that Europe wouldn't risk cutting off that supply, making any new sanctions tolerable.
It turned out to be a major miscalculation regarding the severity and unity of the 2022 sanctions, but it was a calculation rooted in that 2014 experience.
There was also a domestic factor for Putin, wasn't there? The annexation of Crimea was hugely popular inside Russia.
Immensely popular. It led to soaring approval ratings for Putin, this wave of nationalist fervor, often called the Crimea euphoria. This domestic political win gave him a stronger mandate, more political capital, to pursue an even more assertive, hardline foreign policy.
As the Ukrainian Nobel Peace Prize winner Oleksandr Matvichuk put it, Crimea was a test. It was the first time since World War II that one European country had annexed territory from another, and basically the world did nothing forceful in response. She called it a dangerous precedent.
And that precedent had profound consequences. By late 2021, as Putin was finalizing plans for the full-scale invasion, all these perceived signals from 2014 and after likely played a major role in his thinking. The balance of deterrence seemed skewed.
It almost seemed like the West was more deterred by Putin's potential for escalation than Putin was by the West's threats of consequences.
That's the argument made by analyst Peter Dickinson. He wrote that persistent displays of Western weakness over the past 10 years have encouraged Putin to believe he had little to fear from further escalation. Putin started using nuclear threats and talk of his own red lines more frequently to try and intimidate the West into limiting its support for Ukraine.
So the narrative inside the Kremlin, shaped heavily by the 2014 experience, was one of Western indecision and risk aversion when it came to Ukraine.
Putin seems to have become confident he could use massive military force against Ukraine without triggering direct Western military intervention, as long as he didn't attack NATO territory itself. Sources argue this overconfidence, rooted in the West's earlier restraint, is a key factor explaining the decision to launch the invasion in February 2022, likely believing Kyiv could be taken quickly.
Deterrence 101. Your adversary has to believe the costs of aggression will outweigh any potential gains. After 2014, did Putin believe that about attacking Ukraine further?
The evidence suggests he didn't. He saw a West that seemed unwilling to impose costs beyond economic sanctions he thought Russia could withstand. The credibility of NATO, defending a non-member like Ukraine, looked increasingly doubtful in his eyes.
Especially when Western leaders explicitly stated Ukraine was outside NATO's security umbrella. That effectively told Moscow, no Western soldiers will stand in your way inside Ukraine.
A foreign policy assessment put it bluntly. Time after time, the United States chose the least provocative option, which instead led the Russians to become convinced they were safe to carry out the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The argument is that these incremental, cautious Western responses, designed to avoid provoking Putin, actually backfired. They bred a false sense of security and confidence in Moscow.
Were there other factors contributing to this perception in Moscow, like divisions within the West?
Yes. Sources point to things like disagreements within the EU, the controversy around the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, the political upheaval during the Trump administration, with questions raised about the U.S. commitment to NATO, and certainly the chaotic U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021.
Putin likely observed all this perceived lack of Western unity and resolve.
And probably calculated that a major invasion might divide the West even further. His sweeping demands issued just before the invasion, like rolling back NATO presence in Eastern Europe, suggest he might have believed the West was weak enough to actually concede.
It's clear now he profoundly misjudged the Western reaction in 2022. The unity and strength of the response surprised many, likely including Putin himself.
But the point from the sources is that this misjudgment wasn't made in a vacuum. It was, in large part, a product of the lessons Putin thought he had learned from the perceived Western leniency and caution shown back in 2014 after Crimea.
As Ambassador Dalder and his colleague Lindsay wrote, Putin's conviction that the West would abandon Ukraine stemmed directly from that weak response to Russia's earlier aggression. It was like a self-inflicted wound to Western deterrence credibility regarding Ukraine.
Boris Johnson's hindsight admission that it was a terrible mistake to let Putin get away with, Crimea really encapsulates this view. By not punishing the first transgression decisively, the West arguably made its future threats less believable.
Okay, another micro recap, focusing on Putin's strategic thinking. After Crimea in 2014, Russia interpreted the cautious Western response as weakness and a lack of resolve. This emboldened Putin, making him believe the consequences for further aggression against Ukraine would be manageable. This calculus, shaped significantly by the 2014 experience, contributed heavily to his misjudgment in launching the full-scale invasion in 2022.
Alongside this strategic calculus, the Kremlin worked hard after 2014 to shape domestic narratives in Russia to justify its actions and prepare the ground for potential future confrontation.
How did they do that?
Well, the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine was consistently portrayed in Russian steel media, not as a popular uprising, but as a Western-orchestrated neo-Nazi coup d'etat. This framing was used to legitimize Russia's intervention in Crimea and Donbass as defensive or even humanitarian actions.
Painting Russia as the rescuer, not the aggressor.
Precisely. State media relentlessly pushed the narrative that NATO and the West were the real aggressors, using Ukraine merely as a pawn to undermine Russia. Putin's speeches leading up to the 2022 invasion consistently hit themes established back in 2014. Russia had a moral duty to act, Ukraine was run by Nazis, the West and NATO provoked the crisis through eastward expansion and by arming Kyiv.
And how were Western sanctions framed inside Russia?
They were used as further proof of Western hostility and aggression, feeding into a narrative of Russia being under siege, unfairly targeted just for defending its interests. This helped cultivate a rally around the flag effect.
This narrative shift was also reflected in official Russian strategic documents.
Yes, Russia's 2015 national security strategy and its updated military doctrine explicitly identified NATO expansion and Western influence in neighboring countries as the foremost threats to Russian security. Russia was officially portrayed as being besieged, which justified tightening domestic controls and increasing military spending.
So this domestic messaging was about setting the stage, making any future large-scale action seem like a necessary response.
It framed any potential invasion not as an act of aggression, but as a forced reaction to Western encroachment. Putin's ultimatums issued in December 2021, demanding NATO rollbacks, were likely intended partly for this domestic audience to show he tried diplomacy first. When those demands were inevitably rejected, he could tell the Russian people he had no choice but to act.
Did Russia's actual military doctrine change much after 2014?
It became more assertive, yes. The 2014 doctrine clearly named NATO as the primary adversary and signaled a greater willingness to use a wider range of military tools, including potentially nuclear threats, as part of its deterrence posture.
We saw Putin using that nuclear rhetoric quite explicitly around the 2022 invasion, didn't we?
Yes, both before and after the invasion began. Sources describe this as Putin skillfully exploiting fear of escalation, using nuclear saber-rattling and warnings about crossing Russian red lines in an attempt to deter direct Western military intervention and limit the scope of Western support for Ukraine.
And domestically, that Crimea consensus, we talked about the surge in public support after the annexation that played a key role.
A huge role. It became central to Putin's image as a strong leader restoring Russia's greatness. Those sky-high approval ratings gave him a powerful mandate to pursue his hardline policies and marginalize dissent.
So the information environment inside Russia was heavily managed.
For years, the state media machine focused relentlessly on alleged Western perfidy, NATO expansion, sanctions, even cultural issues like LGBTQ rights, all framed as an assault on traditional Russian values and security. Ukraine was portrayed as a battleground in this existential struggle. By 2022, many Russians had been conditioned by this narrative to view the war as justified, or at least unavoidable. Putin's framing of it as a special military operation rather than a war was widely accepted initially.
Okay, let's wrap up this chapter. End of chapter mega recap. The path to 2022. Following Crimea, Russia interpreted Western caution as a green light. It constructed a powerful domestic narrative of Western aggression versus Russian defense. This, combined with a strategic calculus fueled by perceived Western weakness, ultimately led Putin to misjudge the risks and launch the full-scale invasion, believing Western deterrence regarding Ukraine lacked credibility.
Flashcard facts for this path.
Remember the 2014 Western response? Sanctions, condemnation, but no lethal aid initially and no military intervention over Crimea.
While President Obama stated the U.S. wouldn't fight Russia over a local conflict like Ukraine.
Putin interpreted this lack of forceful response as tacit permission to push further, like supporting the Donbass conflict soon after.
But Western deterrence clearly failed to stop Putin's escalating aggression against Ukraine between 2014 and 2022.
So Putin's calculation evolved. He came to believe the West would likely abandon Ukraine in a major conflict and that Russia could weather the anticipated sanctions.
The annexation of Crimea provided a major boost to Putin's domestic support, the Crimea euphoria.
And Russian military doctrine and state rhetoric increasingly framed NATO and the West as the primary existential threat, justifying confrontation.
Now, it's important to understand that the Syria and Crimea episodes, while hugely significant, aren't seen by analysts as isolation. They fit into a broader pattern identified in the sources, stretching across roughly 2 decades, say mid-2000s to mid-2020s.
A pattern where a whole series of international incidents have seemed to chip away cumulatively at global perceptions of U.S. credibility and its strategic strength.
And this period is particularly significant because it follows that post-Cold War, post-9/11 moment of perceived American unipolarity. Expectations for U.S. power and influence were incredibly high then.
So, against that backdrop, any perceived failures, missteps, or instances of hesitation tend to stand out more starkly, don't they? They get magnified.
Precisely. Let's quickly define terms as the sources do. Global credibility. That's about how trustworthy others perceive a nation's commitments and its stated values to be.
And strategic strength.
That's the perceived capacity and the perceived willingness of a nation to actually project power effectively to achieve its goals and defend its interests. Capacity plus will.
And the sources suggest there's evidence of a shift in these perceptions over this period.
Yes. They cite analyses pointing to a view of America experiencing a relative decline in power and legitimacy. You see it reflected in some global polling showing declining positive views of the U.S.'s impact on the world. And just the sheer volume of commentary about U.S. foreign policy suggests that changed U.S. leadership isn't automatically assumed to be effective or beneficial anymore.
Okay, so let's walk through some of the other key incidents highlighted in the sources that contribute to this broader pattern. We need to go back further than Syria or Crimea.
First, we have to look at the Iraq War, specifically the challenges that emerge after the initial 2003 invasion, say from 2005 onwards.
The justification for the war itself, the WMD claims, the alleged links to 9/11, those were largely discredited over time. But the aftermath was also deeply damaging to perceptions.
You had the prolonged, incredibly bloody insurgency, the explosion of sectarian violence, the immense difficulties in nation building, the staggering human and financial costs.
And scandals like the Abu Ghraib prisoner abuse.
Yes, Abu Ghraib is consistently cited as having a profound and lasting negative impact on America's moral standing. A stain, one former official called it, that cost us enormously in terms of credibility.
Sources we reviewed widely described the entire intervention as a strategic blunder. It destabilized the region, inadvertently created space for groups like ISIS to emerge later, and significantly boosted the influence of Iran.
Critics argued it deflated the myth of U.S. military might built up after the Cold War. Some of the region came to see the U.S. as having replaced a brutal dictator with just chaos, concluding America was far less capable than previously thought. It was seen as a major blow to the rules-based international system.
So the perceived failure in Iraq was multifaceted, undermining U.S. credibility on justifications for war, damaging its image of competence in managing post-conflict situations, and casting doubt on its strategic foresight.
And the Iraq experience had lasting consequences. It contributed significantly to what many call the Iraq syndrome back home, a deep public and political reluctance towards large-scale, lengthy military interventions.
This war weariness, this more isolationist ideological trend, sources suggest this actually constrained U.S. options later on, didn't it? Like possibly influencing the calculus around Syria in 2013.
It certainly seems plausible. And regionally, the removal of Saddam Hussein, who had acted as a counterweight to Iran, undeniably empowered Tehran. This strategic shift fundamentally altered the regional balance, complicated U.S. efforts to contain Iran, and fueled sectarian tensions across the Middle East for years to come.
Okay, moving forward chronologically, the next major shock cited is the 2008 global financial crisis.
Yes, a crisis that originated squarely in the United States, subprime mortgages, complex derivatives, failures in financial regulation and oversight. But it quickly spiraled into the most severe global recession since the Great Depression.
How did this impact perceptions of the U.S.?
Sources note commentators immediately saw it as potentially marking the beginning of the decline of American power. It seriously damaged the credibility of the U.S. economic model and led to widespread doubts about what has been seen as the Western economic model globally.
So the perceived failure here was about the competence and stability of the U.S. economic system itself, and by extension, its global financial leadership.
By exposing deep vulnerabilities in the U.S. financial system, the crisis created a major opening for alternative economic models and narratives, particularly China's state-led capitalism, to gain more traction and legitimacy.
Emerging powers felt emboldened to push for reforms in existing international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank, or even to create parallel institutions. You heard leaders like Russia's Medvedev saying America's financial leadership was ending, or Venezuela's Chavez saying Beijing was becoming more relevant than New York. It accelerated that shift towards a more multipolar global economy.
And domestically in the U.S., the crisis, and especially the subsequent bank bailouts, fueled enormous public anger and discontent. This contributed to the rise of populist movements on both the left and right, increased political polarization, and fed into later America First sentiments.
That heightened domestic focus, that skepticism towards global financial elites and global engagement, that also potentially impacts U.S. willingness to lead internationally or uphold commitments, doesn't it?
It certainly can. A country focused inward may have less appetite or capacity for outward leadership.
Okay, we've already discussed the Syria red line in 2013 and Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 in depth. But it's important to reiterate that analysts consistently place both of those events within this broader pattern of challenged credibility. Syria highlighting irresolution, Crimea raising doubts about U.S. resolve to uphold norms.
Right. Moving further along the timeline, another key incident cited is the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, in 2018.
This was the Trump administration unilaterally pulling the U.S. out of the deal, despite the IAEA, the International Nuclear Watchdog, repeatedly verifying that Iran was complying with its obligations under the agreement.
And this decision was met with significant dismay, particularly from the European allies, the UK, France, Germany, who were co-signatories and had invested heavily in the deal.
Critics argued this severely damaged U.S. credibility. Why make a deal if a future administration can just tear it up, even if the other side is holding up their end? It hurt trust with both allies and potential adversaries.
The perceived failure was clear. It damaged the image of the U.S. as a reliable negotiating partner and significantly strained relations with key European allies who felt blindsided and undermined.
This had broader implications for non-proliferation efforts too, didn't it? If the U.S. can just walk away from a deal like this, it might make other countries, like North Korea perhaps, much more wary of entering into long-term disarmament agreements with Washington. It signals that U.S. commitments might be temporary, subject to domestic political wins.
And it alienated those European allies who viewed the JCPOA as a cornerstone of their security policy regarding Iran. This unilateralism eroded trust within the Western alliance itself, potentially weakening collective action and perhaps subtly encouraging allies to seek greater strategic autonomy from Washington.
Next on the list, the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement on climate change.
Similar dynamics here. President Trump announced the withdrawal in 2017. It took effect in 2020. This move, pulling out of a near universally adopted global accord, was widely seen internationally as an abdication of global leadership on a critical issue, and another signal of unpredictability and retreat.
And while the U.S. rejoined under President Biden in 2021, the sources note reports that a process for a second withdrawal was initiated in early 2025, highlighting the ongoing policy instability.
The perceived failure, signaling a U.S. retreat from leadership on a vital transnational challenge and further undermining its credibility as a reliable multilateral partner.
This back and forth, this political whiplash, as some call it, creates huge uncertainty for international partners trying to coordinate climate action. It also creates uncertainty for domestic industries investing in green technology. And it arguably cedes leadership and competitive advantage in this sector to rivals like China or partners like the EU.
It also became a potent symbol. The Paris withdrawal was often interpreted internationally as part of a broader pattern of American isolationism or unilateralism during that period, alongside pulling out of the JCPOA, withdrawing from the WHO during the pandemic, questioning trade deals. It erodes trust across the board.
Then we come to a very visceral event, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021.
Yes, after 20 years of war, the final withdrawal was chaotic. The swift collapse of the U.S.-backed Afghan government and military, the desperate scenes at Kabul airport during the evacuation, the tragic terrorist attack that killed 13 U.S. service members and many Afghans.
The images were incredibly powerful and damaging. Critics globally called it a debacle, a catastrophic withdrawal. Some argued it severely damaged America's credibility, with commentators even suggesting it marked the end of credible American deterrence. The details, like abandoning Bagram Air Base seemingly overnight, needing the Taliban to provide security at the airport, these were heavily criticized.
The perceived failure here was profound. A major blow to perceptions of U.S. competence, planning, prestige, and perhaps most importantly, its commitment to allies on the ground.
And adversaries were watching closely.
Intently. Sources indicate Russia and China saw the chaotic withdrawal as a symbol of declining American resolve and staying power. A stark failure after 2 decades of immense investment in blood and treasure.
Some commentary explicitly draws a line from the Afghanistan withdrawal to Putin's decision to launch the full-scale invasion of Ukraine just 6 months later. The argument is that it signaled a U.S. unwillingness to bear long-term costs or uphold commitments to partners, potentially emboldening Moscow.
Concerns were definitely voiced that China might see the U.S. as less likely to defend Taiwan, or Russia might feel freer to act against other neighbors. The perception was that adversaries might feel more inclined to test U.S. interests, believing Washington lacked the will or capacity for a sustained response.
And what about the impact on allies and partners?
The abandonment of Afghan allies, interpreters, activists, women leaders created a humanitarian crisis and severely damaged the U.S. image as a reliable partner, seen by many as a betrayal of trust. This could make it harder to recruit local partners in future conflicts, and even existing allies, particularly non-treaty partners, might question the depth and durability of U.S. security commitments and its support for shared values.
Okay, shifting focus to an ongoing challenge: persistent tensions and the U.S. posture in the South China Sea.
This has been building for years, but intensified in the 2005-2025 period. China is asserting expansive, internationally rejected claims, building artificial islands, militarizing them, and using Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels to harass fishermen and Coast Guards from other claimant states like Vietnam and the Philippines.
And the U.S. response has involved things like freedom of navigation operations, FNOPs, diplomatic statements condemning China's actions, and efforts to bolster the capabilities of regional partners.
Yes, but sources argue the U.S. has struggled to present a consistent and decisive response. This perceived inconsistency, they say, is undermining its ability to counterbalance China's growing influence. U.S. support for allies in specific incidents has sometimes been seen as unpredictable.
So the perceived failure is an inability to effectively halt or roll back China's incremental gains, which is seen by some in the region as a sign of waning U.S. influence and a challenge to its ability to uphold international law, particularly freedom of navigation.
This is a really high-stakes visible test case. It directly involves U.S. treaty allies like the Philippines, sea lanes for global trade, and a direct challenge from a rising China to the rules-based order the U.S. champions. If the U.S. is perceived as unable to effectively counter China's gray zone tactics, these coercive actions that fall just below the threshold of overt military conflict, allies might start to doubt U.S. security guarantees.
Which could lead them to bandwagon with or accommodate Beijing, eroding the U.S. alliance network in a crucial region.
It also highlights a broader strategic challenge. How does the U.S., with its conventional military superiority, effectively counter a peer competitor using asymmetric salami-slicing tactics designed specifically to achieve gains incrementally without triggering a major U.S. military response? The perceived struggle to present a consistent and decisive response underscores the difficulty in adapting the U.S. strategic toolkit, potentially impacting perceptions of U.S. agility and long-term endurance in this competition.
And finally, the sources also loop back to the U.S. response to the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine starting in 2022.
Yes, while acknowledging the massive U.S. leadership role in galvanizing international support and providing aid to Ukraine, analysts also point to the initial failure to deter the invasion itself, despite public warnings.
And there have been ongoing debates, both within the U.S. and among allies, about the type, quantity, and speed of military aid provided to Ukraine.
Right. These debates and the fact that the U.S. has explicitly ruled out direct military intervention against nuclear-armed Russia lead some analysts to continue questioning the ultimate effectiveness of U.S. deterrence and its capacity to decisively shape outcomes in conflicts involving other major powers.
So the perceived failure here is complex. Initial deterrence failure, plus ongoing questions about whether the support provided, while substantial, has been sufficient or timely enough to enable Ukraine to achieve decisive victory, raising broader questions about U.S. power projection against peer competitors.
It demonstrates the real-world constraints on U.S. power when confronting a nuclear peer. While avoiding direct conflict is arguably prudent, it signals to other states the limits of U.S. military intervention in such scenarios. The sheer scale of aid required has also exposed strains in the Western defense industrial base, raising questions about strategic endurance in a potentially prolonged confrontation.
Okay, let's pause for a micro recap on this cumulative impact. What we're hearing from the sources is a narrative built over 2 decades. A series of distinct incidents, from military interventions like Iraq and Afghanistan, to the 2008 financial crisis, to withdrawals from international agreements like the JCPOA and Paris, to the challenges posed by rivals in places like Syria, Ukraine, and the South China Sea, have collectively contributed to a widespread perception, fair or not, of challenged U.S. credibility, competence, and strategic strength. especially when measured against the high expectations of the post-Cold War era.
Now let's try to synthesize this. What are the common threads, the cross-cutting themes that emerge from analyzing all these different incidents together?
One major theme, maybe the most prominent identified in the sources, is this idea of an erosion of deterrence and resolve.
You see it cited repeatedly. The unenforced Syria red line, the limited consequences for Russia annexing Crimea in 2014, the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, the initial failure to deter the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. These are all presented as evidence suggesting that perceptions of U.S. willingness to act decisively to back up its warnings have weakened.
The argument is that when threats aren't consistently followed by credible action, or when commitments seem uncertain, adversaries feel less constrained, more willing to take risks. And allies, conversely, become more anxious, less certain they can rely on U.S. guarantees.
And the key here is the cumulative effect. It's not just one mistake. It's the weight of multiple instances across different administrations, Republican and Democrat, across different regions and types of crises, military, diplomatic, economic. This creates a broader narrative that transcends individual errors and points towards a potential systemic challenge in projecting U.S. resolve consistently.
It makes you think of that analogy. Credibility is like a muscle. If you don't use it consistently, or if you use it ineffectively, it can atrophy.
That's a good way to put it. A second major theme is the challenge to multilateralism and alliance cohesion.
We saw this clearly with the Iraq War, which deeply divided allies, and then later with the unilateral withdrawals from the JCPOA and the Paris Agreement, which happened despite strong objections from key European partners.
These actions, along with a perceived oscillation between embracing international cooperation and pursuing a more unilateral America First approach, often driven by shifts in domestic politics, make the U.S. appear like a less predictable, less reliable partner.
Allies need consistency, right? They need to be able to plan long-term based on commitments. If they feel U.S. policy can swing wildly from one election to the next, invalidating years of joint effort, it naturally erodes trust.
It does. And it can incentivize allies, as we mentioned, to seek greater strategic autonomy, to diversify their partnerships, potentially weakening the very U.S.-led international frameworks Washington says it wants to uphold. Imagine you're the leader of an allied nation. How do you build a long-term strategy around a partner whose commitments might fundamentally change every 4 or 8 years?
A third related theme is the impact of domestic political polarization within the United States.
Yes, the sources argue that the growing, often bitter internal divisions in the U.S. over foreign policy directly contribute to this inconsistency we just talked about. The swings on the Iran deal, on climate policy, these are direct results of deep domestic disagreements becoming foreign policy.
And this isn't just an internal U.S. matter. Other countries watch this.
They watch very closely. Adversaries see these public displays of division and may interpret them as a sign of strategic vulnerability, something they can potentially exploit. Allies see the political gridlock and policy uncertainty and become more cautious about aligning too closely, making long-term cooperation more complex.
A fourth theme highlighted is the context, the rise of competing powers and alternative narratives. U.S. setbacks aren't happening in a vacuum.
This period coincides with the increasingly assertive rise of China, both economically and militarily, and a revisionist Russia willing to use force to challenge the post-Cold War order.
The 2008 financial crisis gave ammunition to those critiquing the Western liberal economic model. China actively promotes its Belt and Road Initiative as an alternative development path and flexes its military muscle in the South China Sea. Russia undermines democracies and uses energy as a weapon.
And sources note that while U.S. policymakers often acknowledge these challenges, at times the U.S. has appeared distracted by other issues, like counterterrorism for many years, or perhaps underestimated the speed and scale of these shifts, allowing competitors to gain ground and influence.
So the perceived U.S. failures or stumbles are amplified because they're happening alongside the perceived successes or growing assertiveness of rivals. This accelerates that shift towards a more multipolar, more contested global order where U.S. leadership is no longer assumed or unchallenged.
And the final cross-cutting theme the sources identify is a recurring pattern of miscalculation and unintended consequences in U.S. foreign policy decisions.
We saw this with the flawed intelligence and overly optimistic assumptions about post-invasion stabilization in Iraq. Perhaps miscalculating the reaction to not enforcing the Syria red line. Definitely misjudging the speed of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan.
This pattern, appearing across different administrations and situations, raises questions about potential systemic issues. Are there flaws in U.S. intelligence gathering or analysis, in the policymaking process itself? Is there sometimes an overconfidence in America's ability to unilaterally shape complex outcomes.
Some reports cited in the sources even suggest a lack of thorough interagency process or debate before some major decisions like the Iraq War were made.
Whatever the root causes, this recurring element of miscalculation contributes to the narrative of challenged competence and foresight.
Okay, let's consolidate this. Mega recap. A pattern emerges. Looking across 2 decades and multiple U.S. administrations, a series of major international incidents, military campaigns with troubled aftermaths, global financial shocks originating in the U.S., withdrawals from key international agreements, and perceived hesitant or inconsistent responses to aggression by rivals have collectively fueled a pervasive narrative, reflected in global analysis and opinion, of challenged U.S. credibility and strategic strength, especially when compared to its perceived peak after the Cold War.
And the key flashcard facts summarizing this pattern.
Iraq War aftermath, marked by flawed justification, instability, rise of ISIS, empowering Iran widely seen as a strategic blunder.
2008 global financial crisis, originated in the U.S., significantly damaged the credibility of the American economic model and global leadership.
JCPOA and Paris Agreement withdrawals, undermined U.S. reliability as a negotiating partner, strained key alliances, and weakened faith in multilateralism.
It's Afghanistan withdrawal, 2021. Chaotic execution seen as a blow to U.S. prestige, competence, and commitment, potentially emboldening adversaries. South China Sea, perceived struggle to effectively counter China's incremental gains seen by some as a sign of waning U.S. influence and ability to uphold international law.
Oh, and the recurrent themes tying these together. An erosion of perceived deterrence and resolve, challenges to multilateralism and alliance cohesion, the negative impact of U.S. domestic political polarization, the context of rising competing powers offering alternative narratives, and a concerning pattern of strategic miscalculation.
The cumulative effect. All this contributes to a view held by many analysts and international observers of challenged U.S. global leadership in an increasingly multipolar and contested world.
So after digging through all this analysis, what are the main conclusions? What lessons can be drawn, particularly looking at that link between 2014 and 2022?
One of the starkest conclusions echoed across the sources is the direct linkage between the West's response, or lack thereof, to Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion 8 years later. One analyst called the international community's inadequate response to 2014 a geopolitical blunder of historic proportions that emboldened Vladimir Putin.
The argument is that the cautious approach in 2014, while perhaps understandable in its desire to avoid immediate conflict, ultimately backfired.
Yes. By prioritizing short-term stability and choosing not to confront Russia's aggression more decisively than, the West inadvertently signaled to Putin that the costs for violating Ukraine's sovereignty were manageable. This, the sources argue, didn't deter him. It encouraged him to push further later, leading to the far larger, more brutal war in 2022.
Putin came to doubt Western warnings, doubted the credibility of their deterrence threats regarding Ukraine, and calculated wrongly, as it turned out that the rewards of further conquest would outweigh the risks. A calculation heavily shaped by that 2014 experience.
Of course, it's easy to say this in hindsight. Western leaders faced genuinely difficult choices in 2014. Intervening militarily against nuclear-armed Russia carried immense risks, but the path they chose, primarily sanctions and diplomacy, without providing Ukraine the means to effectively defend itself early on, also carried risks, which tragically materialized later.
They chose restraint, hoping to de-escalate, but Putin exploited that restraint.
That's the core argument. As one analysis put it, for fear of escalating conflict, Western leaders avoided robust deterrence, which convinced the Russians they were safe to carry out a full-scale invasion. In effect, deterrence failed because the threat of truly unacceptable consequences was never made sufficiently credible in Moscow's eyes back in 2014.
We have seen a dramatic shift after February 2022, though. Increased Western unity, much tougher sanctions, NATO reinforcement, massive military and financial aid to Ukraine.
And this a much more forceful response post-2022 underscores a painful lesson that many sources highlight. Aggression, if not confronted early and decisively, often invites more aggression later.
It's that old saying, right? Former UK Defense Secretary Malcolm Rifkin put it as, "If you don't punish a bully, he keeps coming back for more." Boris Johnson's admission about making a terrible mistake by letting Putin get away with Crimea reflects this dawning realization in Western capitals.
From Moscow's viewpoint, the weak response to Crimea seemed to confirm their narrative of Western decline and division. It was a narrative, sources suggest, that Putin himself came to believe too strongly, leading him to overplay his hand in 2022 and make his own huge strategic miscalculation about the unified Western response he would face.
So has Western credibility been restored by the strong response since 2022?
Partially, perhaps. The sources suggest the unity shown, the willingness to impose significant economic costs and provide unprecedented aid, has partially restored credibility. It demonstrated that the West could act decisively when pushed far enough. But as analysts lament, this restoration came only after immense human and geopolitical costs that might have been avoided or at least mitigated by a stronger stance earlier.
It's a sobering thought. Deterrence delayed is deterrence diminished.
A scholar quoted in the sources captured the tragic irony. By choosing half steps and compromise in 2014, the West led the Russians to think they were free to do as they pleased. Crimea casts a very long shadow. It taught Putin the wrong lesson that the West wouldn't fight for Ukraine. And it taught the West a hard lesson that inaction or insufficient action in the face of aggression can lead to far worse outcomes down the line.
So, looking ahead, the task is rebuilding that deterrence credibility, not just in Europe, but globally. How do the sources suggest that can be done?
It requires consistency, clearly communicating red lines, and demonstrating, not just stating, but demonstrating through action, a willingness to impose decisive consequences when those lines are crossed. No more ambiguity, no more perceived half measures.
And specifically regarding Russia and Ukraine.
It means continuing robust support for Ukraine to repel the invasion, effectively correcting the mistake of 2014. There's a strong warning in the analysis against any outcome that rewards Russia's aggression, for example, a premature ceasefire that leaves Russia in control of occupied territories.
Because that would just reinforce Putin's worldview that aggression pays off.
Precisely. It could validate his calculus and simply set the stage for the next conflict once Russia rearms. The challenge for the U.S. and its allies is to convince adversaries, through sustained action and resolve, that the era of perceived ambiguity is truly over, that the lessons of the past decade have genuinely been learned. Only then, analysts suggest, can credible deterrence be reestablished.
We started with that tense moment around the Syria red line in 2013, examined how the cautious Western response to Russia's 2014 Crimea annexation shaped the path to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and then broadened out to look at that cumulative pattern across 2 decades, incidents that analysts argue have collectively challenged global perceptions of U.S. strategic credibility and strength.
And understanding these historical threads, these perceived failures and the reactions they provoked, isn't just an academic exercise, it's for making sense of the geopolitical landscape you see today. It helps understand the pressures leaders are under, the tough choices they face, and the very foundations of international security, which seem much less stable than they did 20 years ago.
It really leaves you, our listener, with a fundamental question to ponder, drawing directly from this analysis. If the credibility of a global power rests so heavily on consistently matching words with actions, but domestic divisions and the risk of strategic miscalculation constantly challenge that consistency, how does a nation like the United States effectively rebuild trust? How does it navigate a world where rivals seem increasingly eager to test its perceived limits? And ultimately, what does all this mean for the future of global order and stability?
The red line in Syria was meant to defend a norm. What it did instead was dissolve one. Assad survived, chemical weapons returned, and across the globe, in Crimea, in the South China Sea, in the war rooms of Moscow and Tehran, a new lesson took hold: that American resolve is negotiable. This begins that moment. We've asked the machine to educate us on the first great power to act on it, Vladimir Putin, as he redraws Europe's borders in the shadow of Western hesitation. Next episode.
Please like and subscribe.